Roshni Act. What is Roshni Act? These days, this has become a very familiar term related to Jammu and Kashmir. Formally, the Jammu and Kashmir state land, that is, regarding vesting of ownership to the occupants, this is an act which belonged to 2001. It was passed by the then National Conference government, led by Farooq Abdullah, to give ownership to people in possession of state land with a cutoff of 1990 and against a payment as determined by the government. Since the aim was to generate resources for hydroelectric power projects, it was called Roshni. The English word for it is Light Act. Now let's know more about this act. This was enacted in 2001. The law sought to regularize unauthorized land. The act envisaged the transfer of ownership rights of state land to its occupants, subject to the payment of a cost as determined by the government. The government said the revenue generated would be spent on commissioning hydroelectric power projects, hence the name Roshni. Further, through amendments, the government also gave ownership rights of agricultural land to farmers occupying it for free, charging them only rupees 100 per kernel as documentation fee. In 2009, the State Vigilance Organization registered as an FIR against the several government officials for alleged criminal conspiracy to illegally possess and vest ownership of state land to occupants who did not satisfy criteria under the Roshni Act. Further, in 2014, a report by the Comptroller of Auditor General (CAG) estimated that against the targeted fund of 25,000 crore rupees, only 76 crore had been released from the transfer of encroached land between 2007 and 13, thus defeating the purpose of the legislation. The report blamed irregularities including arbitrary reduction in prices fixed by a standing committee and said this was done to benefit politicians and affluent people. A year later, the High Court struck down the Roshni Act. The Jammu and Kashmir government has now begun an exercise to retrieve the land granted under this act to beneficiaries. There are allegations related to irregularities in the implementation of Jammu and Kashmir State Land, that is vesting of ownership to the Occupants Act, also known as Roshni Act, which has now been declared null and void. On 1st of November 2020, the Union Territory Administration cancelled all land transfers that took place under Jammu and Kashmir State Land Act 2001. The Jammu and Kashmir administration has recently released a series of lists of alleged beneficiaries of the Roshni Act of 2001, now scrapped, which gave ownership rights to the unauthorized occupants of the state land against a payment of a premium. Political leaders and bureaucrats have been among those named. The transfers are being probed by the CBI. Following a recent order by the Jammu and Kashmir High Court, the administration has annulled the act and decided to retrieve land transferred at the Roshni scheme. Right-wing groups in Jammu have described the scheme as being aimed at changing the demography of Jammu region, while mainstream political parties have accused the government of being selective against Muslims. A year after the High Court struck down the Roshni Act of the Jammu and Kashmir government, it has now begun an exercise to retrieve the land granted under this act to beneficiaries. So there are allegations related to irregularities in the implementation of this act, also known as this Roshni Act, which has now been declared as null and void. So this is about Roshni Act.